Good morning, everybody, or whatever time it is for you. I feel very honored to be invited to speak here. I've been, it's gonna make me sound very old now, but when I sort of reflect back and when Sarah asked me to talk, I was like, oh my gosh, I've been at the intersection of extractives, sustainability, and geopolitics for about 30 years. And I've really gone from on the ground, frontline operations, projects, living in communities in West Papua, doing baseline human rights assessments, all the way up to advising boards and excos on geopolitical risks, sustainability trends, and what's coming over the horizon that we should really be thinking about. And when I look at sort of the different areas, we sort of look at different time frames. So we have geological time. It's a very long time. We have the extractives time and the way extractives think about time. And of course, extractives, whether it's oil and gas or minerals, is also quite extended. It takes what, and you correct me, Sarah, now, but it's probably what, 15, 20 years from a greenfield discovery to an operating mine. I've been lucky enough to work on a couple of those, and it takes a lot of time. Geopolitics, different time frame completely. So a week in politics is considered, a lifetime. So again, very, very different timeframes that these different groups are operating in. And then, of course, sustainability. Sustainability can be both quick and long. So again, we need to be thinking about the impacts of today and what that's going to mean for tomorrow. And are we actually making decisions today that we can't undo? So over those different topic areas and throughout my career, I think, Sarah, you summed it up very well. I mean, the exam question I think I've been answering in all my jobs and everywhere I've been is navigating uncertainty. And I think that for me is, when I saw the title, I was like, certainty? That's a very subjective term. And I think when we look at in the extractives, the people who really are able to make a difference and a change and the ones who can actually feel comfortable with ambiguity and really lean into that and then really move forward in terms of navigating those different uncertainties. Now, when I think about certainty, as I said just now, I think there's different levels of certainty. So if you talk to an engineer about gravity, they're pretty certain about gravity. When you talk to engineers about designs of tailings dam, they're pretty confident and certain about the design of those tailings dams. But as we saw after the tragedies at Samarco, when you're engaging with communities, you can give them all the science, all the data, but they don't feel very certain about the fact that that tailings dam is going to stand up or continue in perpetuity. So I think, again, all these things are very, very subjective. So how do we think about navigating uncertainty? What tools do we have in our toolbox? And of course, leadership, the whole point for me, leadership is about making those decisions in ambiguity and moving forward without having the perfect data, without having all the details, without wanting to know that all the information is perfect. That for me is where leadership really needs to step in. And the tools we've got, for me, risk tolerance and appetite are things that I don't think we talk enough about. And when we do talk about them, sometimes I feel that we talk about them in very empirical ways, and it's all around numbers and probabilities. And sometimes it's a gut feel. So for different people, it can mean different things, talking about your risk appetite and tolerance. I've sat in many a risk workshop run by people who are all about the numbers. When other people were in a risk workshop, they're like, it's just the vibe, man. I just don't want to do that. And that's also, and that's a valid input. And I learnt mainly from Sarah, actually, in all the years of working with her, that risk and going through these risk processes is actually a social process. So the moment you step into risk as being a numerical, way of factoring down uncertainty into numbers that people can get their head around and make decisions, then I think you've lost the actual richness of what risk is all about, which is about having those social process discussions where what you're really asking is you're asking for people's different perspectives, different lived felt experiences, and that just diversity that's going to help you make a much richer decision in the long run. The risk tolerance and appetite for me is really important, and I don't think companies put enough weight in it. I've been in boards and excos where they've wanted me to reduce geopolitical risk of a country to a number. And I'm like, well, no country's ever going to be a 10, hardly a 9 in this day and age. And, you can't actually put a number on a country. If I think about the DRC, where I've worked doing exploration projects, the DRC is a huge country. And Katanga is very, very different to Kivu. So, how you could possibly assign one numerical value based for the whole country without looking at those opportunities, I find really limiting. And I think it's very, very short-sighted. But the value of having those really honest, rich tolerance and appetite conversations is what is going to give companies the agility and the advantage. Because what you want to be doing is having those honest discussions up front. So you're almost laying out your guardrails so that every decision that you then make can be filtered through. Now, nothing is ever fixed. I have two children, and when I was in the midst of when they were very young, I was at my wit's end because neither of them slept. And my mother wisely said, "Nothing lasts forever, Froydis. Things change." And I guess that mantra is so true that the only thing that is constant is change. And so even if you look at your risk appetite and tolerance, you need to be very mindful that this is actually a snapshot in time. And you need to be revisiting it with new information, with new experiences, and you need to keep this as dynamic as the context in which you're operating is. And so the final thing I wanted to talk about, just to flag today, is about context. So context is unbelievably dynamic, no matter where you are. Nothing is fixed. As much as people want it to stay the same, it never really does. And I've been watching with a sort of a little bit of bemusement all the things that are happening at the moment in the Gulf, and people are like, oh my gosh, it's all changed, it's all changed. I'm like, really? I mean, this is a region that has had volatility in it for a long time. And, why people didn't actually start thinking about the constraints and the dependency on certain geographical features like the Straits of Hormuz, that is what I find fascinating, that people haven't gone through, again, to the risk piece. Where are our biggest risks? Where are our dependencies? How are these local contexts interacting with each other? I used to work a lot in Latin America, and of course, in Peru, there was quite a lot of elections on a regular basis when I was working there. And of course, everybody was like, oh, the Peruvian elections, what does that mean? There was all sort of panic. And then actually, at the end of the day, Peru's growth rate carried on. We still carried on working there. So I think it's really about really understanding those local contexts, how they play out, and then how they interact more broadly in the global context. So all politics is super local, but then local politics can then really get amplified into macro. And we see that currently now. We saw it in COVID with supply chain dependencies where people hadn't really thought that through. And so I think as part of your risk process, the other key component is to really, really understand your context. And the only way to do that is to really work with people who understand those local contexts, who have been out in the field, who have worked in those local governments, and who really have what we call that sort of fingertip feeling about what's going on. And as you said, Sarah, we're in a world where there's just so much massive information. And unfortunately for leadership, your ability to navigate through ambiguity has just gotten harder with the sort of tsunami of information that you need to filter through. But the only way you can really do that is to work with that diversity of people who have lived, worked, think differently, and for you to really be able to distill that information to make those decisions there as well. So I think to sum up, everything's changing. It always will. The only way to do it is to actually have some honest conversations about your risk appetite and where you want to be. And the only way you can have those honest conversations is by bringing in that ability to understand the local context, which is only possible by bringing in that diversity of viewpoints from everybody, from the local communities, local politicians, local businesses, national governments, thinking more broadly about people who understand those areas and really bringing that big picture together. So with that, I'll leave it there. Uncertainty is here to stay, but you can navigate through it.
Amazing. That was truly brilliant. Thank you very, very, very much, Froydis. Round of applause from all of us. Now, we do have a number of questions that are coming in. The first one is, yeah, in terms of setting that risk appetite tolerance, or those guardrails where we say, okay, this is what we're aiming at, here's the wiggle room, and if we go outside of that, then okay, we have a problem. In your experience, how do you create the environment in which a leadership team or a decision-making team can be honest enough to set those, those lines in the sand?
So I hesitate to say it's about psychological safety and trust. Um, but I mean, that's how you really create those honest conversations. And it's about the leadership having the humility to step into the space of, I don't know everything,
Hmm.
and actually really deferring. I mean, leadership is not about having all the answers. It's about being able to know who to ask to help you make those really informed decisions. And so I think for me, it's about that humility within leadership teams to ask the dumb questions, and then actually really try to ask people their opinions and be curious, be curious about people's perspectives. I remember having so many discussions about these different country risks that I was putting up to boards and excos. And, there would be what certain exco member that would be, no, we're not going into country X. And I'm like, what? This is really a visceral reaction. And instead of going, oh, he's dumb, it was like, well, actually, let me ask the question, hey, what can you tell me about your experience in this country so I can fit that into the process? Anyway, it turns out this person had been held up, had an armed robbery in that country while on exploration. I was like, okay, that is helpful. Now I understand what your fears are. Let's actually work through and see if those fears are still grounded today because that context has changed. And then it's really appreciating that dynamism of the context as well. So I always say to boards and excos when they're looking about going into certain countries with the country risk and the sustainability profile, I was like, look, the rocks don't move. They haven't moved for a long time, but governments and regimes change. So that's why you need to be having these honest conversations that previous prejudices need to almost be sort of left. They need to be an input, but you also need to be open to what the new contexts and new opinions are telling you as well. So, in short, it's about creating that sense of honesty amongst the team and that curiosity to really go outside the initial five people that you would talk to.
And is that something, Froydis, where, as people are promoted up through an organization, what I find sometimes is instead of people then kind of going up into the whole, no, now I'm a leader, it's my job to ask those questions, to be curious. Sometimes when people are promoted, they kind of, they're still that subject matter expert. So they feel like
Mm.
I should know everything about it. And almost that liberation where it's like, no, 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 that's no longer your job. Your job is to be curious. How do we get through that?
100%. Somebody drew a pie chart for me years ago, which was the higher up the tree you go. If your pie chart when you're starting out your career is about your subject matter expertise, the more senior you go, the less you are doing your subject matter expertise. And so, that's really about that sort of self-awareness in leadership is about you are no you when you make the contract to step into that leadership space, you're almost relinquishing some of that subject matter expertise. You have to now bring the next generation of leadership through in terms of those experts. And so part of your job is to really capacitate and enable that next generation. And then your job with all of your experience is to actually ask the questions. That's what is really needed. So I found that as I've gone through my leadership journey is actually taken jobs that I didn't really know much about in some instances. And that in some ways is super liberating because you can actually be the person like, hey, I haven't done this for 50 years, so I'm going to ask the questions. And actually asking the questions that people from an outsider perspective and getting other people to ask questions and just be curious gives you much more insight than trying to hold on to things that you learned maybe 20 years ago that actually may not still be relevant.
Yeah, that's a really important point because, of course, as you say, the world moves on, and part of that is technology or the ways of thinking about things, etc. I think one final question with regards to people feeling safe enough to say, "Oh, hang on a second, what about that?" or being vulnerable. I was on a call recently with a large mining company, and we were talking about how, yeah, if you set your appetite and tolerance, it's then all about if you've got the controls in place, are they actually effective? And what was really interesting was they fed back to me, they said, I don't think we are brave enough to say we're out of control over here. And I thought, okay, that's a problem. But I think actually that was a really honest thing for them to admit. And so then it's a case of going, right, how do we embrace that and go, okay, if there is a culture internally where people don't want to say, I think we're out of control, how else do you get to that without putting that person perhaps in an embarrassing
Mhm.
position or somewhere somebody feel like fears for their job?
Mm.
I don't know if you've come across that anywhere or how you've navigated it.
Many times. Um, I think so. I would say there's a couple of ways you can do this. Use the process.
Mhm,
Corporations are basically the sum of people, and people make some bonkers decisions, people make some good decisions, but around them is process. And I think the risk process that we have in companies, especially in the extractives, is really robust. So use the process. I mean, when I was at Anglo, I think you remember, I used to love when internal audit came. I was like, oh my God, I am so happy to see you. And they're like, whoa, we never get this. And it was because I really wanted the internal auditors to give me that different perspective. And then I could use their findings to hold this up to my leadership team and say, hey, this isn't Froydis saying we have a helicopter issue. This actually came out through the process. And I tell you who does care about this, and it's the boards. So the other way is to really understand corporate governance, because at the end
mhm,
of the day, boards are accountable for the enterprise risks. And so I would recommend anybody really understand the governance processes that you have within a company and use those. They are there for a reason. And when you know how to use them, use the system, make it work for you, because people do take notice. And I've often said, okay, well, I'm knocking on a door that's not going to open. So
mm,
how else can I get this message across? And either finding consultants to say it for you or to use the risk process so an audit report says it, or working with the board, because I can tell you, I've never worked in a company where the board has ignored those orange and red blobs on a page when it comes to managing enterprise risks and the control framework suitability. So I'd say don't just think about your expertise, build your stakeholder cohort. So sometimes you carrying the message is not the right person, and then really understand the governance and use it. It's not there as a burden, it's there for these specific reasons as well.
awesome. One final question, if I may, and this comes in from Lucy. And Lucy's asking, what do you see are the things that teams most often forget to consider when they're thinking about risk?
Going outside the team. So I would say be super curious and just ask questions. So again, if you're doing a risk on a certain topic, open it up, see who shows up, and invite people who people tend to default down going like, okay, I'm doing this risk assessment on, I don't know, vehicles and driving. Therefore, I need these vehicles and driving experts. Get a couple of people who don't know anything about the topic, and
Mhm.
they will give you the richest or the questions where you're like, huh, I don't actually have the answer to that. So I would really emphasize that diversity of thought and perspective, and you will not be disappointed.
Amazing. So, on that note, please, everyone, put your hands together for the one and only Froydis Cameron-Johansson. Thank you very much, mate.
Much.
Brilliant.